I saw at that time and then try to extrapolate for some concept of what it means today. I must say that Skip just about stole everything I was going to say about certain items, but that's what happens when you're fifth in line, I guess. But I will spare you from reading from my book, but I do want you to know that there are 10 copies here that I brought. If anybody wants to get it, you don't have to buy it. I'm just giving it away, and I'll even maybe sign it at some point. We talked about the personal element. This is a little off the mark, but I was older and had never marched, I was against the war in principle, and I had written about it, but I had never been a part of the people who actually marched in a war, against a war, or served. So I had this sense that maybe I should try to learn a little bit about this. And in 1982, or 81, I was with a group of Vietnam veterans who were opposing the Reagan budget cuts. Among many of the cuts was for the VA services, and they were trying to cut the vet centers, which you all know were so terribly important for delayed stress. And a group of women who had been all in a religious organization and had come. So what we did was we stepped over a piece of the lawn in the White House and promptly got arrested. And here I was, a journalist who'd spent a lot of time inside the White House, and there was Sam Donaldson yelling at me, "Myra, what are you doing?" with my hands cuffed behind my back. And so we went to jail, and we made the decision to spend the night in jail because two of the women could not go away. And I'm telling you this experience because I keep thinking we are all so sheltered in our real lives, and going into prison, even for one night, was something that I did not want to repeat. There was some humor in it. We were there with all the hookers and the bag ladies, and we were talking to them, and we started going out, and one of the women said, she had on a bathing suit and this long top, and she said, "Would you please what can I do, because I've been here before, and this judge will certainly not help me out." So we took the top and made a skirt and wrapped it around. We were all having this sense of togetherness, and we walked through, and one of the men who was helping take us through looked at her, and he said, "Holy Jesus," because she was so good looking, and the woman behind him had her Bible with her. Without missing a beat, she said, "Yes, he is." Anyway, that was my experience, my war experience. But I think one of the things we have to keep remembering in looking at this war is what a class war it was. Much more so even than the Civil War, where you could pay your way to get out. We just have to look at the statistics. For example, there were 27 million men who came of age, 3 million fought in combat, a total of 9 were in the service, and the rest docked the war in whatever way they could. Now, you know, a lot of time and effort was expended on being angry at the ones who chose not to go. And there were many, as I said, just like you were saying, it's hardly a monolithic group. There were many who were coolly calculating their way to success and took every loophole they could and went with it and cared not one bit about the war. In fact, even supported the war. I found many of those people when I interviewed them, and I think one of the problems when we talk about reconciliation is that they don't want to look back, and they don't want to see exactly what they did to get out, and there are others who are filled with guilt about the people who did go instead. But when you look at that, you have to look at the policy, which was a very benighted, misbegotten war. Everybody here has said this. I had one guy from the South who was an artist who ducked the war, and he said, "Hell, if it had been a better war, I would have gone." He said, "My whole family went to war." And you have to look at the whole period of that time. I know it was a decade, so it spanned more than, the ones who went in 65 were certainly entirely different than the ones who went in 70 in their attitudes and approach. But it was an unbelievably wrenching time for everybody, the ones who went and ones who didn't. It's very hard for even people to remember that in many ways. And when I started my research in 1979, Vietnam was still considered an undigestible lump of life, as one chaplain told me. It just would not go down. And I began with doing two brothers who fought in the same troop. They were 12 in the same troop, and this was not supposed to be after World War II, but it did happen. And they saved each other 3 times, sent 5 Purple Hearts home. One felt the war was a rotten waste and should never have happened, fell into deep depression and delayed stress. His brother thought it was a noble cause that was just not won and became a Reagan administration person. The happy story of those two is that they have now reconciled to some degree. They used to come to physical blows, and then they had loud arguments. They still are ideologically worlds apart. In fact, one of them is now a senator, Chuck Hagel, and when he was when the day when they had the swearing in, they did this mock thing afterwards where they all went with the vice president, and Tom was his brother was standing there, and the whole Hagel family was there, and he said something to Al Gore, and I asked, "What did you say?" And Al Gore laughed, and he said, "I'll help him." And he said, whispered to him, "I'm going to do my best to try to turn him into a Democrat." And he and Al Gore were the only 2 Democrats in the room at that stage. So I felt that if you could have this incredible difference in one family, and who had quite the same experience, how could you not find it improbable that there would be any real coalition or cohesion about the war? And so I got terribly interested in interviewing the veterans because I had seen Friendly Fire, the television show, and I'd seen all about the boy who had been killed by our own firepower. And my son then was 19, this was 1979, and I realized that we, like everybody else, I had the collective amnesia about what Vietnam was all about. And so I started doing my interviews, and I interviewed more than 500 people, and it was really like lancing a boil. It was truly the first time a lot of the people had talked. And somebody asked if being a woman made a difference, and I think it did. I think that somehow they felt safer telling me their stories. I was terribly worried that I was going to get a spin and get somebody who was going to be making up a lot of things, but I double-checked with all kinds of wonderful people. Kevin Bowen was a major help, other people, in helping me, and I feel that it was a true story, and even if the perceptions were not as true as they might be, they were the perceptions that these people felt. And I'm trying to truncate much of it, but when we talk about the homecoming as a metaphor, it was true also. It was very true at that stage of the game. I talked to men who really never forgot the way they were treated when they got off a troop ship. One guy had a hook for his hand, and he was walking across campus, and somebody said, "Did you get that in Vietnam?" And he said, "Yes," and the person said, "Serves you right." Today, it's hard to imagine that this kind of reception was there. And I talked to other men who grew their hair very long immediately so that they could be hidden, and truly felt that they were hidden, hunted creatures in many, many respects. And even in their hometowns, they tried to bury the whole concept. And that did something, even to the ones who are considered successful veterans today. That seared them in a way that I don't think any of us can truly understand, even when you hear their poignant stories about it. And then, of course, we had what other people have mentioned. We had this ridiculous count for winning a war called the body count, which meant that if you killed enough people, you got ice cream and beer. Seriously, they were given ice cream and beer as a sort of reward when they would do the body count. And this, of course, left people with very, very hard lessons about what life is supposed to be in war, and a lot harder legacies. As I said, I interviewed one. What I found was the sense of betrayal and disillusionment. It was sort of metaphorically in one person that I talked to named Jimmy O'Shea from Southie. And he said, I went over there to kill a commie for Jesus Christ and John Wayne, and he lost his leg, and he said, I realized it was all for nothing. If there's another war, I'll drive him to Canada, And he said that he was in the hospital, and Cardinal Cushing came in and said, how'd you lose your leg, son? And he said, I lost it in a crap game. And it was that kind of, World War I nihilism that you mentioned in all the literature that was coming through in these people. And he said, then I have to go to the VA and they check out my leg to make sure that I'm still disabled. And he said, I keep telling them it ain't going to grow. And we just forget that what happened to these people when they returned was more dreadful than most men coming back from most wars. Yes, you have I just noticed that when they did the Tom Hanks movie about Normandy Beach, how they said that there were some traumatic distress situations with World War II veterans who had been at Normandy. And I'm certainly one of those people who subscribe to the war is hell theory in general principle, but we did have this difference. Another major difference was in the way they came home. In other wars, there was a decompression of troop ships, and in this war, because of jet power, you could be home in an absolute matter of virtual seconds, not literal, but virtual seconds. There was one warrant officer I interviewed who had he said, at 1 minute he was a helicopter pilot, 1 minute we were shooting gooks in the Delta, and 72 hours later I'm home with my wife and she wonders why I'm so different. Without that decompression, even though there were the terrible losses of suicide among people who were physically injured, those who made it out said that what really saved them was the camaraderie of being with other veterans together in rehab situations and learning to not feel sorry for themselves. There's this whole group of macabre jokes that would go on, and one of them said that as he was there and he had lost his leg, somebody started whistling, "You'll Never Walk Alone." And he said it was the only thing that saved him. It got him out of his horrible sense of self-pity. And so I think that camaraderie saved them. So no wonder when they came here and came back that they did feel isolated. As I said, we were talking about this concept of a monolithic 60s. Well, of course, that was totally ridiculous. I think one woman somewhere burned a bra. And that became, all of the feminists became bra burners. It was just this media hype to do that, And they did the same thing with veterans, baby killers, and men run amok. And on the other hand, everybody else was supposed to be going off into the sunset in their sandals and beads and change the world forever for the good. And we've seen totally that none of this happened. And I guess I'm quite cynical about the ones who didn't go, who paid no price. I still am. I thought I would get over that by now, but I'm still quite distressed by that. There were the others, though, the handful or so that went to jail, the relative handful, and risked gang rape. And one of the men is a lawyer who spent a lot of his time working with Vietnam veterans. And it seemed to me that when we talk about the divisions in the generation, you do find some togetherness, and the togetherness people seem to be the ones who paid the most price, the ones who thought about it the most on both sides. I think that the Vietnam Veterans Against the War are a classic example of men who paid a very large price and came back and reshaped their thinking as to what this was about. One of the points I wanted to make about that's bothersome when you see the so-called rehabilitation of people like McNamara and others is a price that was paid, as I said, by so few. I mean, this war asked so much of a few people and nothing of most of us. And one of the projects that he came up with was something called Project 100,000. And this project took men from the ghettos and men from Appalachian Hills, men with marginal minds and bodies who had flunked the test before, put them in as a so-called Great Society remedial program. 350,000 of them, they became cannon fodder in far disproportionate numbers. They were called the Moron Corps by the others in the service. This is a heinous part of McNamara. Another part was that he knew about Agent Orange before it had ever come up. He sat in meetings where it had been discussed. One of my great concerns is that since we do not teach Vietnam well, I disagree with the speaker who said that it's going to be taught better. I think he's talking about it totally in a military way. We're not talking about the human cost and the human waste, and it's not taught properly anywhere. I can remember giving speeches and having people look at me and say, well, what was My Lai? Who was Lieutenant Calley? What went on there? Which side were we on, north or south? That kind of ignorance, in part, has stemmed from the fact that many of the people teaching the courses are those who did not go to war. The privileged who did not go often didn't know what to say about how to teach this war, and they had no personal frame of reference. And it also happened again when you saw the media in action. I think one of the great legacies, not great, but an interesting legacy, is that those Vietnam veterans who have made it to the top in politics are far less jingoistic about going to war than many of their counterparts who never saw Vietnam. We now have 6 senators who are Vietnam veterans, and I remember John McCain saying when Hagel joined them after the last election that he said, I never thought there'd be 6 of us here. And of course, again, they're not monolithic, they're ideologically different in many ways, but they really are strong about let's look at what kind of mistakes we're going to make before we do it all over again. They were very much a strong leadership group against Desert Storm and against the Contra movement, going in and helping to so-called save Nicaragua with the Contras. And among the people there were Pete Peterson, who was a POW in the Hanoi Hilton, where he was tortured. Now we have this incredible change in the fact that he is now the ambassador to Vietnam. And he, of course, said they're lying again. They lied about the Gulf of Tonkin. They're lying to us again. When are people going to know? We need those voices, and thank God those voices are there to help. And Bob Carey was saying to me that what upset him the most when they were discussing Desert Storm and other situations was that he said it really mad the media, many of whom never went to Vietnam, who are calling me an isolationist, he said, because I don't want us to go into something that will be absolute folly. He said, I'm far from that. I just want us to be knowledgeable and aware. So there is this great fear that one of our legacies may well be that people either don't remember Vietnam or don't remember it properly. And I think that that's something we all have to guard against. One of the things we noticed in 1984 when my book first came out is that you had this revisionist view, which I called Viet guilt chic, where all these guys who didn't go were writing these paeans about, I missed something, I didn't become a man, I wasn't in war. We had a series, Chris Buckley was one of them, there's several others writing this. Again, we're going back to the mythologizing, glamorizing of a war that was, as I said, very upsetting. People ask about change. In 1993, I did an update to the book and did a look back, a decade back, on all the people that I'd interviewed, as well as interviewing more. And at that point, to me, the celebration at the wall was a very interesting aspect. Greg asked me if I could talk about how does a country heal. I don't know that a country ever heals after a bad war. I was on a panel about war with a Russian expert. This was before Russia fell, and we didn't know what he was going to talk about, and we were on a war on casualties and on a panel on casualties and how this can affect people. And I gave my very soulful speech on Vietnam, and he got up, and you could hear a pin drop. He was a major official in Russia, and he said, our Vietnam is Afghanistan. And he said, we will be paying for it for the rest of our lives. And it was really the beginning of the break in which they were being honest about what had happened to them again in a war that had made so little sense. And I think it takes a long time to heal, but if there is any kind of healing, I think the wall has done it. I've been there, and I've never ceased to be amazed at the way people write their private little memos and notes and how other people are moved by it. And when the wall began, it was done by a handful of veterans. They had no money. They had to do it all themselves. They had to push for it. No one on the Hill was eager to help. A decade later, here they were, both those who went and those who didn't go, giving speeches of reconciliation. And as I said, the wall has become as American as apple pie, and I think in that we have to kind of worry about, again, the sense of ancient history and, again, glamorizing something that we should not glamorize. But on the other hand, it has brought its sense of closure for many, many people. I really felt that another part of this was what happened with this generation. We now have two baby boomers leading the country. One went to Vietnam, Al Gore, and one ducked the war. We have to know that, Clinton, of course, and we have to know that this wouldn't have happened. There's no way that they probably would have been elected 10 years before. We're now in a generation where it is the baby boomers who will be leading us. That doesn't mean, again, that they're monolithic. We've seen the right-wing approach to much of everything that went on in the 60s, and that I was always amazed at how the Republicans very successfully fought the 60s for a very long time, just as Skip was saying. Yet they didn't win because people forget that out of that period came the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the sense of individual lives, that it's okay to be gay, it's okay to live any way that you might particularly want to live privately, even though these privileges are undermined in many, many places. You do see that it's never undermined that much, and I think that this last election proved that people are just not going to buy into this critical view of private lives, and I think that we have to recognize that as a major legacy also, that is one of a positive one. As far as the veterans and the post-traumatic stress today, I think most of you are far more of an expert on that than I am. But I do think that the saddest thing in one way, but also one of the most powerful legacies, is the fact that the veterans introduced the world to post-traumatic stress. When I started writing the book, there was absolutely no understanding of it. There was very little understanding of Agent Orange even. Some people called it Asian Orange. These very people who suffered so heavily have now brought that into our consciousness. And I did a whole section on the book on combat fatigue, and obviously that was what was called in World War II, and we all look back now and we can see examples of that showing up in daily stress. But, they were treated so terribly at that time. At the time I was interviewing many of them, the vet centers had just begun. Many of them had been thrown into psychotic wards, and they'd been given Thorazine. They called it the Thorazine shuffle, because they are gorilla biscuits, because they just couldn't move. They were treated like they were schizophrenics, and of course their problems were real problems. They were having back flash responses. I'll never forget one fellow who could not drive he was driving 40 miles out of his way to go to work, so he would not go through town, and his wife thought he was crazy, everybody thought he was crazy, he thought he was crazy. He finally went to a vet center where for the first time he was asked about his war experience. These people weren't even asked about their war experience by regular doctors, and no one even thought that could be a problem. And he finally realized and remembered that a friend of his was buried in that town, and the friend was a man that he felt that he had killed because they were coming out of a river together in Vietnam, and he had the gun barrel down this to help him come out, and as the guy walked up, holding on to the gun went off and killed him, and he lost all memory of that, but it had absolutely fractured his life. Others were not quite so dramatic, but they were, very, very real stories. On the other hand, there were the sad stories of people who did not go to Vietnam. I think one of the groups that were unnecessarily vilified were those who went to Canada. They were not the rich ones who could get off as psychiatrists. They were the ones who went to mostly state colleges, and I interviewed one who I thought had it all. He was a lawyer. His life was fine. I wrote about him as a pivotal example of somebody who said that even though he could not come home, one of the searing things for him was he could not come home for his mother's funeral because the FBI were staking out all the funerals in those days to catch these people coming back from Canada. And about a half a year after the book came out, I ran into a friend of his and I said, "How is Tom?" And he said, "Oh, he committed suicide." So that the lingering effects of that war can touch all of them. I know this is anecdotal, but that's what they asked for, and that's what you're going to get from me. I guess I have to close. But as I said, I think validation of post-traumatic stress has been a positive legacy. And nothing goes by now that you don't see some example of how people are treating this in real life. When you had the Oklahoma bombing, when you have a bus that goes off the road and kills 14 children, when you have some berserk person run amok and shoot up everybody, when you have a woman who has been the victim of rape, there's an immediate sense that there's going to be some response to what is something out of the ordinary. This is not an ordinary experience that one can kind of walk one's way through in many instances. I noticed it myself when I was covering the hurricane, the aftermath of Hurricane Andrew, and I saw homes just smashed and obliterated, and people just walking around with absolutely nothing and not knowing where they were going to go. And I immediately thought, these people are really going to need help. And people were writing that who had never even heard of post-traumatic stress when I started the book. So I just do think there are some positives that we have to center on. And thank you very much.